From the Library of Congress in Washington, D.C.
Welcome to the Library of Congress and particularly to the Kluge Center, whose eminent director, Carolyn Brown, is here in the front row. And I have to make the obligatory announcement to turn off all cell phones, electronic devices, defuse all explosives, such other instructions as we have to give. Anyhow, it's my pleasure to welcome you to today's lecture by Dr. William F. May on his book, Testing the National Covenant, Fears and Appetites in American Politics. Dr. May wrote much of this book while he held the position of Cary M. Maguire Chair in Ethics and American History at the Kluge Center here in this Jefferson building of the Library of Congress. Thanks to the endowment given by John W. Kluge, we now have a scholarly center within the library's flagship Jefferson building here, where mature scholars, sorry about that, can use the riches of the world's largest library to produce and communicate to both our much younger generation of scholars who are also here at the Kluge Center, and also those who affect and make policy in and beyond the Capitol itself. The Cary M. Maguire Chair was created as a research position on Capitol Hill that would explore the history of America with special attention to its ethical dimensions, that would support research that includes, but is not limited to, the conduct of politics and of government at all levels of American life and in all branches of the government. And it would bring attention to the ethical dimensions of leadership, not only in politics, but in religion, business, urban affairs, law, science, and other areas of American life. Now, the man behind this vision is Cary Maguire, chairman and president of Maguire Oil Company in Dallas, Maguire Energy Company, and chair of Components Corporation of America and Stocko Incorporated. He's not only a successful businessman, but is passionate about applying ethics to business and other human activities and American history in general. His home containing a mini museum of American history, as it were. He's a valued member also of the library's Madison Council, and we are very pleased that he has traveled from Texas through the rains, through the security proceedings that greeted you all at the gate today, to join us here today. So I'd like you all to join me in expressing our appreciation to Mr. Maguire, and if you wouldn't mind standing and receiving that. Today's lecturer, William May, joins a distinguished group of prior Maguire Chair holders who include Jim Childress of the University of Virginia, Mark Nolan of Notre Dame, John Bethke Elstein of the University of Chicago, and Judge John Newman of California. We look forward to the arrival of John Whitty, Jr. of Emory University later this year, and to Robin Lovin of Southern Methodist University in 2013. Today's speaker, Bill May, held the Maguire Chair in 2007. He is currently a senior fellow at the Institute for Practical Ethics and Public Life. I rather like that title, Practical Ethics and Public Life, at the University of Virginia. In 1993, served on the Ethical Foundation subgroup for the Presidential Task Force on National Health Care Reform from 2002 to 2004 as a member of the President's Council on Bioethics, and founding director of the Cary M. Maguire Center for Ethics and Public Responsibility of Southern Methodist University. He's also taught and chaired the Department of Religion at Indiana University and Smith College. He's a former president of the American Academy of Religion, a founding fellow of the Hastings Center, where he co-chaired its research group on death and dying. You can see he's got a wide spectrum. He's written widely on the moral and ethical obligations of the healthcare professionals and the relationship that they have with patients, including just a few of the book titles: The Physician's Covenant, The Patient's Ordeal, and Testing the Medical Covenant, Euthanasia and Healthcare Reform. Dr. May's new book talks about religion, but not in any narrow or denominational sense, and about politics, but not in any particular or partisan way. He indicates one of our great hopes that the Maguire Chair would add new substance to the intellectual depth and to the ethical life and imagination of the nation's cabinet. In this very political time, his new book, Testing the National Covenant, Fears and Appetites in American Politics, suggests that the United States was originally put together more by a covenant than by a contract, and how our politics are driven by fears and appetites that he also describes a little more clinically as anxieties and desires. So, ladies and gentlemen, please join me in welcoming Dr. William May.
Thank you, Dr. Billington, for your gracious introduction. I must confess, like any author with a book just out, I cracked the cover and read passages from it somewhat apprehensively, hoping that it would not make me wince. It did not. However, I realized that a book touching on recent politics can provoke deep differences among friends, colleagues, and patrons. My thanks then to Dr. Billington, Director of the Library of Congress, Dr. Carolyn Brown, Director of the Kluge Center here at the library, Dr. Richard Brown of the Georgetown University Press, who is present, and most particularly Cary and Ann Maguire of Dallas, who established the chair in American History and Ethics here at the library. I'm grateful for their continued support, all within the spacious setting of academic freedom. Religion has surfaced again as an issue in American politics. A heavy dose of dualism, religious dualism, makes its way into political discussions today. And it's intermixed with debates over national identity. Religion also appears in the title of this book by reference to a national covenant. And I mean covenant not in the sense of a real estate covenant, a dubious device that flies below the moral level of a contract to wall some people out of a neighborhood, but a covenant in its meaning as an agreement and exchange between people that brings them together more deeply, more broadly, and more indefectibly than the word contract admits. Now, there are at least 4 ways, as I understand it, to understand the question of national identity that bear on the American scene: unnatural, natural, contractual, and covenantal. By unnatural, I have in mind an identity imposed by violence. Only Native Americans and African Americans suffered an identity violently imposed by conquest or by enslavement. In contrast, the Western concept of a natural identity highlights those properties human beings share in common that transcend any differences based on race, culture, or custom. Both the Roman Catholic doctrine of the natural law and later Enlightenment thought about a common human nature affirmed, at least in principle, such a natural identity. Well, whatever the benefits of this universalism, Roman Catholics, its chief religious bearers, were not sufficiently numerous or powerful at the nation's founding to shape the country's early sense of itself. Further, the manifest plurality in the origins of European immigrants made it difficult to claim an American identity simply based on a common human nature. We seem to be one out of many, not simply one by nature or blood. The book, therefore, concentrates on the third and fourth ways of interpreting American identity: contractual and covenantal. These two competing accounts of our origin and prospect as a people figured prominently in the nation's founding. Contracts and covenants resemble one another. They appear to be first cousins. They both focus on a promise. They both include an agreement and an exchange between parties. However, in substance, these promises do differ markedly. Contracts tend to be external. Covenants are internal to the parties involved. We sign contracts in order to discharge them expediently. Contracts are limited and time-bound. They demand only what the contract specifies, whether a contract to fix plumbing or deliver a product. The word covenant, in contrast, such as the covenants of religious people before God, or the covenants of friendship and marriage, or of a people covenanting together, ratify and extend forward into the future beyond the particulars of an agreement. Contracts operate at the level of buying and selling, and we depend upon heavenly day by day. Covenants, in some measure, also interact and augment at the further levels of giving and receiving. The promise contained in a commercial contract echoes the familiar history of negotiated deals struck by self-interested parties. It describes much that went on in the economic life of Americans across 150 years prior to the country's founding, and showed through in the Constitution to which the founders signed their names in 1787. So understood, a contract constructs an entity out of the multiples of self-interest. Now, this contractualist account of origins emphasizes the importance of choice, pure and simple, in creating a unity that was not there before. In the midst of that plurality, a gathering of men in Philadelphia drew up a contract that they felt would satisfy multiple, but perhaps overlapping interests, and thus project the country toward a unity. So conceived, the United States was not at its founding, and I quote here an historian, a fact, a given reality. It was a dare, a project, a construction out of materials hitherto and perhaps continuingly multiple. Now, on the surface, a sunny, secular optimism seems to accompany this notion of a nation founded on a contract alone. It appeals particularly to immigrants weary of the burdens and intransigences of Europe. However, a built-in pathology also lurks in an identity so founded. A nation that comes into being solely through a contract is not antecedently grounded. It doesn't result even in part from the discovery of a reality in which choosers already participate, except what may be shifting self-interests. It comes into being through invention. And choice is tricky. This unease of choice leads to a peculiarity in American politics, that is the need to demonstrate the absoluteness of the choice. Nothing less than being 100% American will do, and nothing is more lethal than being tagged an un-American. Anxiety throws a long shadow over the identity of the nation and its citizens so founded. Now, some have discerned a still darker religious apprehension in pathology, underlying a contractualist account of national identity. Anxiety haunts the nation's origins, not simply because its identity dangles from wobbly choices. Rather, a harsh necessity drives the original choice: the fear of theft, murder, fire, and invasion without the security of the contract. One needs magistrates, police, the military, and fire brigades to protect one's own vulnerability, the vulnerability of one's life, liberty, and property. Such a government is religiously driven in the sense that it derives its power from the towering evils that would beset the self's own interests apart from the government's protection. One needs the government in order to be sure that one can securely fall asleep at night. Now, this contractualist account of American identity faces a deep inner flaw, and I speak not here of the multiple contracts that we make day by day in exchanges that are productive of goods in the marketplace. But its narrative about origins doesn't adequately address the problems of either runaway fears or appetites. It begins as a defense of strictly limited government to protect against negative threats, but at length a fear of the negative can dominate as the nation fights against the evil du jour, foreign powers, domestic enemies, strangers in the neighborhoods, aliens in the lettuce fields, whatever. A government founded on fear, if it's founded on fear alone, is easy prey to runaway fear. At the same time, a contractualist account of origins in self-interest leaves little resource for curbing runaway appetites. While it restricts too much the government to the task of quelling a specific set of fears, it lets the appetites run free, too freely, for the whole of one's life. It justifies the government's negative role to provide for the common defense, but dismisses the government's further positive role there, right in the preamble of the Constitution, its responsibility to the common good. As the preamble to the Constitution put it, to promote the general welfare. Now, this one-sidedness issues from the doctrine that imposing is the supreme evil. Government can impose taxes and regulations only to fight the evil of imposing through theft, murder, and so forth. The government cannot tax or regulate for other purposes, so argue some. Such mission creep would be perverse. When the government taxes for the purpose of promoting the general welfare, it begins to resemble the original evil which it is obliged to resist. The government should not take on the role of the outlaw in Sherwood Forest, is the way the argument is put today sometimes in politics. A covenantal understanding of the founding has a promise, but it differs from a contractualist account in that it recognizes the original promise as a response to a reality already incipiently there. Look at the grammar. The Constitution begins with this given reality. We the people. At the very top of the first sentence in the preamble. This reality purportedly serves as the agent of the promise that follows. The document does not begin with a plurality or an aggregate of self-interested parties. It begins not with we the individuals, or we the interest groups, or we the factions of the United States, but with we the people. The people are already there as a given, not simply a given in the sense of something that individuals are stuck with, but a gift, an imperfect gift upon which the people now purportedly build. This gift does not appear out of thin air. It presupposes a history of mutual giving and receiving and bearing with one another, spread across 150 years in the midst of all that buying and selling that accompanies it. On the face of it, the we seems to be not a construct, but a reality, acting as a communal agent of a construct that moves beyond its original imperfection toward a more perfect union. The answering promise acknowledges the ground, deepens the bond, and alters the future of a people forming their life together. The concept of a covenant holds together a doubleness in American identity as gift and task, reality and project. The nation is both a community and a community in the making. I won't cover in this brief talk the biblical and theological background of the story here. Instead, I'll offer a few comments on the political challenge to the very notion of we the people. Some have argued that the declaration, we the people, is a fiction. According to the economic interpretation of national origins, the property classes mounted a revolution to reject the tyranny of taxes imposed from abroad. A decade later, they devise a contract with sufficient executive and legislative authority vested in the federal government to provide a reliable framework for commerce between the states and to protect the country against foreign threats and destructive waves of populism. To these ends, 55 men of property created a fiction. The people purportedly functioned as the agent and protagonists in their playbook that would protect their interests and those of their progeny. These men of property, protecting themselves, simply spoke with a louder voice by saying, we the people. Well, expanding on this theme, one of the deans of American historians, Edmund Morgan, argued that fictions figure across the board in politics. The success of government requires the acceptance of fictions, requires the willing suspension of disbelief, requires us to believe that the emperor is clothed, even though he is not. So the government of the United States, like other governments, begins with a make-believe. And James Madison, the primary drafter of the American Constitution, seemed to recognize this fabulous element as well. In July 1819, he observed, quote, "The infant periods of most nations are buried in silence or veiled in fable, and perhaps the world may have lost but little which it need not regret. Without further comment, this account of origins suffers from a difficulty deeper than the historical question of defending the virtue of men of property against the charge of veiling their impure motives in a fiction. In fact, some of them had exposed themselves to considerable risk by signing the Declaration of Independence. Their signatures on the document amounted to a death warrant should the undertaking fail. The novelist Flannery O'Connor, however, exposes the deeper difficulty in her account of the role of myths in human affairs. She once observed, "You know a people by the stories they tell." The novelist had in mind not fictions in the sense of untrue or made-up stories, but myths as stories in which people recognize themselves. Myths are narratives so deeply true that people repeat them, appeal to them, and act them out. Myths order expectations and mold sensibilities. They shape people cognitively and morally. Cognitively, they give them a vision of their world and themselves, and morally, they cue them, telling them how to behave in the light of these perceptions. They assign them their duties towards themselves and others. Now, its mythic power helps explain why the storyline of "We the People" in the preamble to the Constitution took hold with Americans, why Americans didn't dismiss it as a mere fiction, why the preamble supplied them with a basic narrative of which the body of the Constitution furnished the law. The writers themselves were not engaging in pure invention. They could draw on 150 years of experience with varying degrees of self-governance in North America. When they said, "We the people," they didn't create simply ex nihilo. The founders began not with nothing, but with a reality, a given. The given reality was not simply something they were stuck with, but a gift, a very imperfect gift with which they struggled. People in some 550 towns in New England had engaged in civil self-government, and as many people acquired experience in the governance of church bodies in that region and elsewhere in the nation to be. The perceived element of gift differed in the two settings, ecclesiastical and civil. Religious people recognize God as the giver of gifts, including the gift of their common life as a people and their duties as citizens. Others certainly would not use biblical language, but the element of gift was there. They recognized the given of their life together as citizens, which they honored by engaging in public deliberations and by serving variously their neighbors, and with at least a walleye on the question of the common good, in all midst of all the bustling and give and take of buying and selling. Either way, whether as members of civil or ecclesiastical bodies, people were used to the rough carpentry of legislating, the business of executing and enforcing laws, and the solemn task of judging disputes amongst themselves. Together, these functions constituted the public life of a people, and these activities constituted what John Adams and others at the time called their public happiness, a phrase that sounds odd to modern ears. Neither the word people nor the phrase public happiness was a fiction. We are so used to associating happiness with private happiness that we can miss today the animating principle of the American Revolution and the Constitution following. Sam Adams and others affirmed the principle of no taxation without representation, not because taxes would reduce their purse and thus subtract from their private happiness. The taxes on tea against which Adams and others protested were minuscule. Being taxed, they objected instead to being without representation. Being taxed by the British House of Commons deprived them of their public happiness. Their right to be seen and heard and to make themselves understood in public forum and in political dispute with their fellows. The political right since 2009 has sought to link its Tea Party protests against taxes with the revolutionary protest. The link is false. Leaders of the modern right oppose taxes because they see them as diminishing their purse, that is, their private happiness. This complaint hardly resembles the revolutionary protest, which was not against taxes, but taxation without representation, which denies citizens their public happiness, their right to participate in the public domain. The founders sought to affirm this domain not only by resisting British authority, but by their relocation of authority, where their own exercise of it in cameo convinced them that it belonged in We the People. The Americans already had in place, locally and incipiently, and very imperfectly, the culture and institutions that would help shape the society to come. So goes the celebratory account. No one, however, has diagnosed more acerbically the deep flaw in this story than Barbara Jordan, the Texas Congresswoman. She remarked that when the founders proclaimed "We the People," they left her out. Worse yet, the founders counted her and her slave ancestors as 3/5 of a person, thus increasing the relative political weight of their masters' votes in calculating the number of representatives the slaveholding states would enjoy in Congress and the power those states would wield in the Electoral College. Barbara Jordan's prophetic judgment lays bare the fact that the content of the covenant, its provision on slavery, fails a test set by the source to which it appeals, we the people. That source sets a standard of moral coherence by which American life will need to be measured over and over again. The original storyline that begins "We the People" is not simply a false claim and fiction. It is a myth that possesses, for better or worse, demiurgic power. That is, the story sets up a dynamic. It brings into play what is not yet fully there. You say "we the people"? Well, how then is it that you go on to say 3/5 of a person and define me out as a black, as a woman, or still others, as immigrants? Such questions will be asked in the continuing history of the country. The force of Jordan's question has a power of its own, the import of which not even some of the bards who wrote and tell and retell the story fully realized. Again, the historian Edmund Morgan, while referring to "We the People" as a fiction, also recognized the revolutionary import of that fiction, placing we the people at the head of a sentence in founding of government, profoundly repositioned people with respect to sovereignty. Until then, people were among the ruled, not themselves rulers. Even in pressing their rights, the people could do so only as subjects ruled by others. They had to petition others, the king, a body of aristocrats, or the church, who exercised sovereignty over them. But in this instance, the ruled recognized themselves gradually, but inevitably, as rulers. This huge shift in sovereignty to the people redefines responsibility. The people could no longer pass off their responsibility as though they are the ruled. The people become accountable to themselves for the results of their rulings. The myth of we the people is demiurgic in the sense that it begins to set in motion facts out there that produce a world more accurately corresponding to the myth. If people are not simply the ruled but rulers, Barbara Jordan and other people like her in the constitutional era, some 16% of Americans at the time, well, they must be counted in. The myth begins to produce a blowback upon itself. It opens the windows and doors to the people. The ruled begin to recognize themselves as rulers and hold themselves and others to it. The Americans begin to see that government originates not with a king with whom the people make a contract, with some principle of sovereignty antecedent to themselves, but rather solely with a people who make a covenant with themselves and a grant of power to government, which is merely their servant. The bitter ordeals of the Civil War and events beyond eventually tested and extended the commitment to what Lincoln compactly called a government of the people, by the people, and for the people. The phrase recognizes the people as imperfect human source, means, and end. Such a government calls for the virtue of gratitude, a tempered patriotism in receiving what we already are, the virtue of repentant wisdom in determining our course, and the virtue of hope as we move toward those ends that define our common task. Now, the book wrestles through its pages with the unfinished covenantal agenda ahead as it bears today on a foreign policy driven by runaway fear and a domestic policy by imperious appetites. A paragraph about each. Fear of the Soviets tempted the United States to defect from the identity as a republic and adopt an imperial agenda, first in the Cold War and then in the war against terrorism. At its worst, this aggressive agenda brooked no limits in its ambition to dominate the world economically and militarily. Alternatively, the government pursued irregularly, but more wisely, a policy of containment in its dealings with the Soviets. The diplomat and foreign policy analyst, George Kennan, who helped shape the latter policy, also recognized that containing Russia, first and foremost, required America's own self-containment, a disciplining of its fears in order to sustain its own identity as a republic. It should not become an empire in its firm response to imperial threat. This need for self-containment reappeared as a challenge in the later response to terrorism as America bulked up and tried to wield unsuccessfully what was called at the time unipolar power. Meanwhile, runaway appetites tend to drive the decisions of ordinary consumers about cars, houses, food, mortgages, and reckless debts, and to spur the ambitions of those living above tree line for yet more in the way of bonuses, stock options, leveraged buyouts, tax havens, sweet deals, and golden parachutes, until at length the market's dizzying ride led to a crash. The crisis of 2007-9 produced a dramatic shift from heedless prodigality to anxious frugality, from a paroxysm of appetite to a paralysis of fear. And the economist Keynes sought to restrain this damaging overreach by proposing a counter-cyclical fiscal policy that would contain runaway desire in good times, partly through taxes and regulations, and counter runaway anxiety and distrust in bad times, partly through public investments. Now, you may notice a resemblance here between Kennan's emphasis on the importance of self-containment in foreign policy and Keynes' recognition of the need for a disciplined, counter-cyclical fiscal policy to help a nation counter its dangerous swings from appetites and fear, between appetites and fears. The book closes, and with this paragraph I close, with a chapter on the issue of immigrants and undocumented workers, because that issue exposes dramatically the contrast between a contractual and a covenantal ethic, and it sorely tests our core identity. Morally, Americans are loath to forego the convenience of laborers on the cheap, to mow lawns, haul garbage, build tract houses, pour cement, dig potatoes, pick lettuce and tomatoes, clean toilets, change pans, slaughter cattle, and often work multiple jobs without overtime pay or health benefits. We pay them off contractually with depressed wages, and then suddenly resolve to enforce the law on 10 to 12 million of them, and pack them off without too many twitches of conscience about the devastating impact on families. However, how can we find a more humane way of addressing our responsibilities to the undocumented without unduly burdening the more vulnerable of our citizens already here, who have suffered the most from the huge supply of laborers from elsewhere? We have concurrent obligations to both the vulnerable insider and the stranger. These obligations strain against one another. We cannot simply take from the impoverished to help the destitute, leaving our own sheepfold untaxed, untouched. No given piece of legislation can perfectly balance the claims of competing parties. Yet in its imperfection, an immigrant nation that declared boldly at its outset, "We the people," needs to recognize in the face of the stranger from whose labors it has massively benefited, a major test of the covenantal agenda ahead. Thank you.
Mr. Mayor has consented to respond to questions, so if we can have somebody identify yourself, we have people familiar. Yes, Carol.
I'm old enough, Carol Brown, I'm old enough to remember a time when the notion of common good, maybe the 60s and 70s, was kind of part of the discourse that you saw in newspapers and magazines and whatnot. And somewhere along the line, I'm not quite sure where, it dropped out of the conversation. And we don't hear that phrase very much. And I wonder, I see it as being part of your contractual versus covenantal way of thinking, but why do you think that changed? Why did it change?
Well, there's been a struggle about that for a long time, the question of the common good, which was part of conversation at some times and not others. First, it must be noted that I'm a Protestant in background. It must be noted that all the way back when William Perkins was influencing the United States, he defined a calling, a vocation, as that whereunto God hath appointed us to serve the common good. So it's not just a Catholic notion. You find it in Catholic thought primarily through the decades and kept us alive in the setting of Catholic thought. That tended to get replaced in the course of time in an understanding of a calling as a career, and that whereunto my SAT scores have appointed me to serve my own private goals. So we lost that fit between calling to serve the common good with struggling along in life in such a way as to serve my own way to a private patio. The other problem is that you hear a lot of talk about the common good, but it ends up too vague. Because one has to distinguish between fundamental goods and high goods that are part of the common good. There are fundamental goods which are important to human survival: food, clothing, shelter, and so forth. And then the higher goods of education, research, art, culture, and so forth, which are the higher goods. Now, the complexity is these goods compete with one another for claim to public resource. But it's not only these lower and higher goods that are competing for public resource. They have to compete against the notion that the task of the government is simply to protect my private goods, and therefore a move to supply those taxes necessary not to replace all other sources and provision for the goods. For after all, the primary responsibility is to make sure that the marketplace system does its job: food, clothing, shelter, and so forth. But it's wrong for people oriented to a common good to assume that absent this kind of care within the society at large, we simply ignore the question.
If I could continue this line of inquiry. First of all, by defining one as higher, you introduce the implications that that is somehow more noble, or you don't mean that, but I mean in terms of the discourse with which we imperfect words with which you try to talk about very basic things. If one is fundamental, that's basic, but then something's higher comes in a little differently. And I wondered, one of the most interesting points to me was your word count of the founding documents of the country, where the most used word was liberty and the second most was public virtue. Now, is that the same thing as fundamental goods and higher goods? But it seems to me public virtue is a term that's not used very often. At least I don't hear it mentioned around when I look at current documents. But is there some guide to the covenant as distinguished from the contract in the idea of public virtue?
Yes, the word liberty was the most often used term at the time of the Revolution, public virtue the second most often. And it was used in the time of the war with the sense that unless in their liberty people sacrificed for the common good, our survival was at risk. And but other thinkers argue not only is public virtue important in fighting a war, it's also important in sustaining the kind of republic that we are creating. Yes. Now, the difference between fundamental and higher, the ancients used to distinguish between the goods of survival and the goods of flourishing. And Aristotle argued, for example, that the importance of the state is not only to help us survive, but to assist in our full flourishing as a people. So there is a distinction drawn between fundamental goods oriented to survival, goods, further goods oriented to a full flourishing of a people, the goods of being and the goods of well-being. Now, I'll never forget a time when I tried to run a conference down in Dallas on the question of nonprofit institutions. And I tried to involve both those who were giving charity to those in real need at the level of survival, along with Meadows, who gave the money for the School of Arts and so forth, which were related to what I called here the higher goods that do bear on human full flourishing. But I noticed that Mrs. Meadows said, we have a problem joining together. I thought the nonprofits ought to have something in common. But she argued that we don't fare well if we want to talk about the higher goods when other people there present are now talking about this emergency room and this destitute family. So there is a competition between those goods that bear on survival and those goods that bear on human flourishing, although they do overlap. Because now we argue that a higher education is crucial to survival sometimes and certainly to flourishing. And that high good, research and development and so forth, is now talked about in a way that is important to America's survival and flourishing. So there's an overlapping between the two levels of good. But the further good I didn't mention, I talked simply about goods of substance related to survival and flourishing. There are also the goods of process. And if you talk about the unfinished agenda ahead for America, you have to talk about the goods that relate to substantive concerns for goods. But we have to think about what further moves does the United States need to make with regard even to its own Constitution, so that we don't stall in ways that are disadvantageous to us in supporting our long-term survival and flourishing. Yes, sir.
My name is Howard Rosen. I'm with the Peterson Institute for International Economics here in Washington, and my question actually follows up exactly where you've just left off. First of all, I want to thank you for the gift that you've given us this afternoon, and I hope I'm not guilty of the runaway appetite that you have talked about. But I wonder if you could just speak a few minutes about this idea of a covenant and common values and how that applies to our globalized society today. Is there such a thing? Can there be such a thing? Does there need to be such a thing as a global covenant? How do we operate in a system of multi-covenants?
Yeah. It seems to me to be easier for us at this interim moment. I am nearsighted. I don't see how far in the future lies a global covenant. In theological circles, I remember a theologian who said, when you talk about love of the neighbor, you have to distinguish between love of the near neighbor and the far neighbor. And which is not to speak pejoratively of the far-off neighbor, but to recognize that the moment in which we really think day by day in these terms is very far off indeed. But in the meantime, we have to think how we understand power, and to think about in terms of three prepositions. One way of understanding power is first over others. The second is first apart from others. And the third is simply understanding ourselves as a nation. We have responsibilities to the immediate first, but first among others. And it seems to me, as we think on the foreign policy arena, we went through the 30s of a time of thinking first apart from others, thanks to having the two oceans. And so the isolationist draw in America was very powerful. Then, winning a war, we moved into an age where we began to think of first over others as a solution to the problem of imperial threat. And what I found attractive about Kennan is that sense that in responding to imperial threat, a power that thinks in terms of first over others, you have to be firm, but in containing Russia, you have to contain yourself. Thirdly, however, increasingly, after the unipolarism that was talked about in the late 1990s and the first decade of the 21st century, we have to find a way to lead the world instead of dominate it or withdraw from it. And that's a very loose answer to a much more demanding question.
I thought her question about the public good was, right on, and reminded me about when you were the founder of the Maguire Center for Ethics at SMU. It was the founder for the Ethics Center in Public Responsibility. Oh, yeah. Okay, I'm sorry. My voice is not carried as well. In relation to public good, when you founded the Maguire Center for Ethics and Public Responsibility, you felt that public responsibility is a part of this whole scenario which involves the public good. So my question is this: in considering the public good and the public responsibility, should there be some question about pay as you go, or how much can you borrow and then have our children and grandchildren have to pay for it, even though it is for the public good? Is there some balance there that should be?
Yes, the question is how far can we go in supporting public goods? Aren't there limits on that? I tend to follow those who say the United States is not in the position of Greece now, on its way out, over the precipice. And if you're going to talk about our responsibilities to our children, first and foremost, I don't deny you don't want a debt that is unpayable. But on the other hand, you want to make sure that the resources that we have go into the kind of quality of education that they will need to sustain themselves in that future. And we cannot be so prodigal in our tasting of goods as to diminish resources that are important for sustaining the life that they will hope to live. And so there is, and it's not entirely through the private sector alone that one will solve those problems. I taught at Indiana University, which is a public university. One of my arguments to use for my secular colleagues was when you get idiocy from the pulpit, you're getting what you deserve. If you don't invest sufficiently in the kind of education, public education, that will not make people over-susceptible to one flood tide after another. So, yes, there are limits in what we do. Now, I don't want to get beyond my depth here, but I am aware of that an investment was crucial in avoiding a free fall in the marketplace, and further investments are crucial to make sure that we are not stalled with too large a group of unemployed people who have no stake in the country, and that money is needed to support education. This is not the right time to diminish our investment in such things. And that is also part of the long-term future. So I'm answering by admitting your point and introducing two further points without denying yours.
Hi, I'm Sam Garrett from the Congressional Research Service here at the library. Thanks for your comments. I have a question about specific terminology and some of the terms that you're using and whether or not they would be applicable in the modern political sense. One of the issues that I research is U.S. territories policy, and as you might know, there are a couple of territories that refer to themselves as commonwealths, and in particular the Northern Mariana Islands, for example. The governing document that governs the federal government's relationship with the territorial government is called a covenant. And there's sometimes some debate in this area about whether terms like commonwealth and covenant have any modern political or policy meaning. So I know this is a fairly specific question, but I'm wondering if in your research, did you come across any hints about whether the framers in particular meant for terms like that to have particular meaning over time?
I don't know to what degree the perspicacious Madison and Hamilton anticipated a future where we would find useful commonwealth. And maybe there are other scholars here present who have read that literature to know what the answer is. The word covenant, was, you find in some of the founding documents preceding the founders. Pact is another, compact is another. I tend to see at the heart of the notion is that life is not exhaustively defined by buying and selling. It's the important arena in which we live. It's defined by a further arena of giving and receiving, and that is not simply restricted to our private life, but it is a way in which a nation and large-scale organizations within it might be further nourished and sustained if they understand that there is something further needed to make them survive. And the word covenant for me is helpful on that account. How it would work out if we worked through our relations with Puerto Rico and so forth in the future, I'll be interested to hear from others of you on that. Thank you.
This has been a presentation of the Library of Congress. Visit us at loc.gov.